All right. So, with me, I have Ross Scott of Accursed Farms. You know him through Freeman's Mind. You know him through Ross's Game Dungeon. And most recently, what we'll be talking about today is Stop Killing Games. So, Ross, I know you've done this a million times, but in a nutshell, what is Stop Killing Games?
No, it's fine. Well, it's a general movement, but the big aspect of it right now is a European citizens initiative where, well, the entire theme of Stop Killing Games is to basically require end of life plans for online games so that when customers pay money to play them, they're not left with nothing when support ends the way it commonly is now. And there have been a few avenues towards trying to achieve that, but
So, it was The Crew that was kind of the Ubisoft game, The Crew, which shut down servers in the spring. So, what about The Crew made it like the perfect storm for this?
It was primarily because it was a big game put out by Ubisoft, and Ubisoft is located in France, which means they're subject to all kinds of consumer protection laws that American companies aren't. So we just kind of needed that critical mass from a country inside Europe, the EU essentially, because this would have been a dead end trying to do it with an American company. And if the game was real small, then that wouldn't have been able to create enough splash to get the ball rolling. So it didn't have to be The Crew. And in theory, it didn't even have to be Ubisoft, but it did have to be a company within a country with strong protection laws. So
Hmm. So you mentioned where with America it's a lot more difficult. Going back to your Battleforge video, which was July of 2015, so 9 years ago, you talked so much about Stop Killing Games. So in between uh, the Crew and back then, like what were some other games that did you think about going after at that point?
oh well, that kind of shifted in my mindset where I kept hoping somebody with more free time and expertise on this topic I could kind of spark and ignite, and somebody else would do something that I could amplify, but that never happened. Uh, for acting on this, I mean, I did try to get some action on Battle Forge, but it was kind of misguided. The one I kind of considered a little bit after the fact was actually Overwatch, which ironically I haven't even played, but that was a big title that got shut down. They'd sold over 50 million copies of that. So that would have been a lot of people with receipts, but there were other aspects of that that complicated it and made it not such a great case for trying to pursue legal action on this.
Was it because it was like American product?
That was part of it. See, it's confusing because that may not have been the obstacle I thought it was because even American games they have to have European distributors. But I think I could be mistaken on this, but I think for Blizzard Activision, their distributor was in Switzerland, and that's outside of the EU. But they do share some economic overlap laws. But the point is, it starts to get fuzzier
Hmm.
then and more gray, which we needed every advantage on this. But the other aspect of it that made it kind of a mess, even if that was all in line, was that they released Overwatch 2 and that was free. And then people who bought Overwatch had some extra benefits in that. So if a judge was looking at this or a consumer protection agency, they would think, well, they were trying to compensate the buyer for, shutting down one with two. And that would have, again, kind of weakened the entire case. Whereas something like The Crew, no, buyers got nothing. So that was actually good in this respect because it was very clear for any bureaucrat who might not understand anything about video games to understand. So,
You've mentioned for Battleforge, you tried to do something about it, but you said it was misguided. What did you try to do for it?
well, I was trying to sort of rally kind of a PR bomb against Electronic Arts to kind of get their attention and create PR that people are upset about this. But see, that was early. It was partially naive on my part, but that was also early enough. I'm actually not sure what the first one was, but for sure that was one of the first uh, games that were shut down in this way that were purchased as a one-time purchase. In other words, it wasn't a subscription where they told it would expire after so many days, or it was something that you bought in a store like any other game, but then they shut it down and then you can never run it again at the time. So I was hoping that there might be like, if we had enough pushback early on, that the company might respond and have an end of life patch or something. But what I failed to realize is there was basically a firewall between whatever the public says versus what company executives hear. So it was all kind of in vain on my part. Plus, they very likely never cared. It's just that they were one of the first to do that.
Hmm. And yeah, because I rewatched the Battleforge video. You mentioned, yeah, there's kind of the two avenues: the one you just talked about, and then the one which we're talking about today, going down the uh, more of the legal approach to it.
Right.
On your website or for stopkillinggames.com, there's an FAQ which I recommend everyone to read. But you do have a list of real world examples of publishers ending support for online only games in a responsible way. And you've listed Gran Turismo Sport, Knockout City, Mega Man X Dive, Scroll/Caller's Bane, and Duelist. So, what specifically have these games done um, that are kind of like a ending support in a responsible way?
Well, it's actually probably different for each of those games. And Marvel's Avengers is another one. But see, for some of them, they just enabled an offline mode because the game was primarily a single player experience. So that would, but for Knockout City, as an example, that's primarily a multiplayer experience. And what they did was essentially patch it or maybe release some more files. I'm actually not even 100% on the details, but they made it so that you could allow private hosting, which means if you wanted to start a game like as a server on your end and you had a friend who wanted to connect to you or some friends, that they could. It's kind of the way smaller scale, a lot of multiplayer smaller scale games used to work in the late 90s and early 2000s. But they just patched it like that on the way out. So for this now, for a game, I think it's not on this list, but maybe we should add it. For large MMO type games, massive multiplayer ones that normally hundreds of people are connecting to at the same time. Uh, there are a few examples of that. Estonia and Saga of Rhizome, where they essentially released, after they shut down and stopped making money off of it, they released the code for the servers. And the community took to that and kind of it made it far easier to create a server emulator for those so that those games can still be played now, even though the company's not supporting them at all anymore.
So when it comes to all these kind of ways of getting attention for this, the big one right now is the European Union initiative, which is right now sitting at 32% of the required 1 million signatures by July of 2025. So the that petition's been up for about a month. How do you feel about those numbers so far?
Well, I mean, it's a fantastic start, but it's a complete fog to me how it will end up because I mean, for the first few days, it was kind of surging. I mean, we got 200,000 in like the first week or something. And then after that, it kind of has been trickling since. And if it keeps going at the rate it's been, then we're in great shape, but it might fall off. I don't know. This has always been a long shot attempt. I mean, I think it does have the potential to really change the law if we can pass the signature threshold, but uh, whether we can or not, that's a big unknown to me. I will say currently we are, believe, the second largest active European citizens initiative going on right now. I think there's a chance before this ends we'll be the largest one, but even that is not a guarantee
Hmm.
that we'll pass that threshold. So it's still quite ambitious.
You think it might be like a Kickstarter, which is like where it gets a lot at first and then kind of peters off, and then right before that Kickstarter ends, a lot of money comes in, you think? Might be something like that? I
I'm
hope it's
not
not.
even,
I hope it's sooner than that.
not even, I have no faith there would be a surge at the end, actually. It's more like, can we keep this kind of
Hmm.
steady-ish rate going? And maybe we can, maybe we can't. I think the key to it is getting more non-English speakers aware of it. I think that's our biggest obstacle.
Hmm. What happens when 1 million signatures is reached?
Well, unfortunately, we're probably going to need more than that, because once the signature collection period ends, they go and check to see if there are any mistakes people made, or they can't verify identities, that sort of thing. And I understand a significant number can get thrown out that way. So, but assuming we pass even that threshold, uh, what would happen next is it would go before the EU Commission and to be looked at and be considered for making new law on this. And all the official organizers that are a part of this initiative would travel to Brussels to discuss this with the EU Commission. Uh, from there, it's highly dependent on what the EU says. However, I think we have a decent chance for a few reasons. One is, if this was just something ludicrous, we probably wouldn't have even had it approved to be open for signatures to begin with. So if we wanted like jetpacks for everybody, or just if everybody gets free money for life, or something, that would have been shot down before we even got to this phase. So just the fact that it's been open and it's collecting signatures means they consider this within the realm of possibilities for something the EU could act on. And another reason is this would be pretty bad publicity if they were to just dismiss this outright, that, a grassroots movement that received over 1 million signatures, which is not easy, just got thrown out. That would, I think politically, that might create some tension that it would not want. And the third reason, what we're asking for is relatively narrow and quite in line with other similar consumer policies within the European Union, which can have lots of protections for, for warranties, returns, like they're not being deceived. And all we're asking for is, at its core, is that for video games people have paid money for, that when the company's done supporting them, there's still a reasonable chance that the customer can continue running them. And most video games already fulfill this requirement from day one. It's only this smaller subset that just relies entirely on online capability that has been neglecting this, in my opinion.
Hmm. So, with everything over the last month since the petition's gone up, what have been some of the biggest surprises?
Well, let's see. I guess our biggest surprise was we did get some some blowback from a prominent YouTuber,
Yes.
Pirate Software, who, I've seen some dissent towards this, but he was by far the biggest we've ever seen, because he has millions of subscribers. And at first he had a video coming out where he was insulting it left and right, and kept, well, I think it was a values clash at its core, because he was responding to my promotional video on it, and he kept, pausing it and saying, "This is not a problem. This is not a problem. Live service games are supposed to end." And so that's a values clash, because obviously everyone involved with this movement does see this as a problem. We wish to retain these games and keep them in a, some form of working state. Whereas he, I guess, takes more of a business approach to it, that no, there should be no responsibility on the developer or the publisher to do that. And then so he released some videos after that, but he kept misunderstanding large portions of what we're doing. That said, I don't think that would have affected his opinion any, but
I think he's
since
pretty
then,
set. Yeah, he's pretty set in his ways.
yeah, uh, since then that's kind of spiraled out a bit, that a lot of people are reacting to his video, and then that has, maybe not intentionally, but misinformation in it, or misunderstandings. So they're reacting to misunderstandings about the initiative. So that was kind of frustrating, but we're in more of a situation where like any news is good news on this because
Hmm.
again, our biggest obstacle is just awareness.
Yeah. On that note, what are some of the biggest? I know because you made the FAQ to kind of help combat some of that, but what are some of the
Yeah.
biggest you find to be some of the biggest misconceptions about stop killing games?
Probably. Well, okay. I guess the classic one, which thankfully hasn't popped up too much, so I think I've been pretty good about combating that one, is that we're asking for companies to host the games forever, and that's not it at all. We're actually in favor of companies shutting down the game and ending support whenever they want. It's just we want the game to be in some form of playable state. So that's been a common misconception. I guess another misconception is that we're insisting all games this occur for all games as they are right now. So in other words, whatever game has been released, that has to be changed to meet this requirement. And we understand that may not be possible for many games. Most of the focus is on future games, but even for present games, there are options that the publisher would have, some nicer for them than others, to be in compliance with this, even if we got everything we wanted and this passed into law. So I guess the way I would frame it is a whole lot of the focus is if you're designing a new game from scratch, nothing's been coded yet, that in the future it could be a requirement if it's an online one that you would need some sort of end of life plan as part of that design. So I think when some people realize that's the primary focus, that's a much more reasonable request than insisting some game that's been up for 10 years and was never designed for this and might even have legal obstacles towards complying with it has changed. So I've seen a lot of pushback and the thinking, well, wait, we made this game that's never designed for that. You don't know what you're talking about. This can't be done, yada, yada. We've thought, we've taken that into consideration. So that's another big misconception. I'm trying to think if there's others. I guess, I think this is maybe, I guess one is that some people are concerned that this would just kill all online only games because of this requirement. And I think that's a misconception for two reasons. One is that, again, if this is done from the design phase, this does not need to be an exorbitant cost for publishers and developers. In fact, I think it gets a lot easier cost wise as it goes on. It could even be almost automatic. Again, it depends a lot on the game and how it's designed, but whereas something like I compare it to like something like loot boxes, which is a separate issue, but that is highly, highly profitable to the gaming industry. So that's something they would fight every step of the way. Whereas here, I think it could be a matter of just taking the path of least resistance, where okay, we know we're going to need to have an online, we're going to need to have an end of life requirement. So we're going to need to budget in a few extra days or a week to implement that from the design phase, and that's it. But the other reason I think it wouldn't be such a it wouldn't be an existential threat to these types of games is because the European Union is a very large market. The idea that you wouldn't make these games in that market, you would be talking about millions of euros in lost sales or possibly billions for really large companies. Or even if they did decide, okay, we're not going to bother in the European Union, well, then other developers would be happy to rush in and take that market. So it's not this stuff can be held to implement again if no consideration was ever given towards that, but we're trying to accommodate for that. But it does not need to be moving heaven and earth if it's planned for from the beginning. So
Mhm. I know you've mentioned specifically France, Germany, and Australia as good countries. I guess as more on the consumer protection end, like what makes them such ideal candidates for stop killing games or pushing it forward, I guess is what
well,
I mean.
yeah, this was more for, well, it still is ongoing. This was more for a kind of a separate avenue we were taking, separate from the European Citizens Initiative, where, well, obviously for Australia,
Yeah.
where that's where the crew came in, because the crew isn't connected to the Citizens Initiative in any direct form. What the crew did was a big obstacle on this practice is in many countries, it's not clear if what's going on is even legal or not, because it feels like a classic case of business moving faster or technology moving faster than government or law. Like I've compared it several times to when Uber first came on the scene, where governments weren't sure if these were taxi services or are these considered employees or contractors, because the law just simply wasn't written for that kind of situation. And I think it's very similar for games of this nature, because the vast majority of them are sold as one-time purchases with no stated expiration date, but then they depend on an external service, and that external service you're also given no duration of. So that's not how most goods or most services behave. So it's unclear if this is legal and just the law needs to adapt to it, or if no, they're going too far with this in an anti-consumer way and they need to conform to what's expected of regular goods or services. So on that note, we were trying to use the crew as sort of a missile to get the attention of government to give us a clear answer on this issue. And while it hasn't completed, I think we've been very successful in that. So for France was the natural candidate for this, because Ubisoft is a French company. So that's kind of ground zero where this takes place, that this is in their own backyard. So, and we got extra lucky in that France, their consumer protection agency, also accepts complaints worldwide. So that made this, that was very helpful, because that meant that all Americans could send complaints to France.
Wow.
That doesn't mean they're going to get any. Now, if you're outside of France, that doesn't mean you're likely to get any compensation for losing the game, but it does mean you can report it, and this is a problem, which was our primary focus, to get them to examine what Ubisoft in this case was doing. I mean, I'm picking on Ubisoft. It's really a lot of the industry. It's just that they were the target of convenience. Now, for most other EU countries, what we found was if we tried to report on this, then they generally only applied to businesses operating within their country. And if it was another EU country, their general approach was to just forward this to France's Consumer Protection Agency for a French company, which is what we were already doing anyway. Germany was an exception in the sense that their Consumer Protection Agency was powerful enough that they could make a ruling on this, even though this is about a French company that's conducting business in Germany. So it's possible other EU countries would have also qualified that we just happened to miss, or else we just didn't get enough help on. Like, I think Sweden might have been our third candidate, but we just weren't able to get things together on that front in a clear way. Because we were utterly reliant on volunteer help on this, because, I wasn't going to know all these different laws that are in, not even in English, and trying to interpret that. But so Germany was one that was powerful enough, and Australia was its own separate thing. And there was a lot of there were a lot of indicators to suggest that these might fall under similar laws as digital goods, in which case a lot of this might not be legal. So that's why we had to escalate it to their consumer agency also. Again, for most other countries, it felt like the protections were just either too weak or we weren't able to get enough information on it. One sort of halfway exception is the UK, which we're actually going to be probably resuming action on in September, hopefully, where the UK situation got quite confusing, where we started some efforts, but then they dissolved Parliament, so that reset a lot of things. And their Consumer Protection Agency, or one of them, the Competition and Markets Authority, is due to receive much more authority to act on things soon. maybe in September. I'm not sure. So it's just as well we're waiting on that. So they might have a second approach with them, but it gets more complicated. But that's the basic version of it.
Speaking of complicated, I know you've mentioned for the United States, it's you pretty much have to go to Congress to get something like this going. So, what about the United States makes it such a uphill battle?
Well, this one, like you said, it would take an act of Congress pretty much. A lot of this I learned only this year. Actually, we got lucky and received some volunteer help from pro bono from an American lawyer, and he did some research on this issue because we were originally pursuing trying to set some sort of precedent by under one of the states. What he found out was that it just wasn't possible. What happened was there is law pertaining to this, based on a court case called Pro CD Inc. versus Zeidenberg. And I'm simplifying this grossly, but the very simple version is the conclusion of it was more or less that they decided the way software works is very complicated, so they were just going to defer to the end user license agreements for almost everything. It is more complicated than that, but not for what we're doing. Like it would have to be a different issue, like if you wanted a refund where it might come into play. But so the end user license agreements for almost all these games more or less say they can do whatever they want.
Yep.
That's actually working against them in the EU. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying I'm agreeing with you. They say whatever they want. Yeah.
Yeah, and so in the U.S., see, this can even circumvent state law because let's say a state comes out with a very pro-consumer law to kind of protect consumers against, losing their products or things like that. Well, in that end user license agreement, it might say all disputes on this will be settled by an arbiter in California. So by doing that and having the states more or less recognize how I'm forgetting some details now, but how the EULAs are handled, the license agreements under the guidelines of Pro CD versus Zeidenberg, that overrides all that. So it's almost like it circumvents the state law entirely. I suppose in theory you could get this passed in California as opposed to at the federal level, but I wouldn't count on it. Additionally, because California is going to be very pro-business in this respect, because they are where Silicon Valley is located, so they're not going to want to make waves on this. Now, one option we did find, or I found, was to have a direct ballot initiative. However, there are two problems with that. One is that this is kind of a niche issue. So in order for that to really gain some traction, this would have to be a more mainstream issue. And that's kind of understandable. If people were talking about like wanting taxes lowered or, wanting better healthcare provision, stuff that affects way more people than just video games and can be more serious. But the other is that in order to even propose that, you needed a high volume of already registered voters. And I was doubtful how big the overlap would be between, just general consumers or gamers who were concerned about this versus being registered in the state of California to be able to act on this. And I have no faith in my ability to influence, lawmakers at the federal level. That would take, I tend to be on the cynical side of things. So I think that would just take trucks worth of money to pay lobbyists to get influence like that.
That lawsuit you were talking about, when was that lawsuit from?
I think 96, and
Oh,
it was
God.
decided in 99. Or yeah, I was in high school when this all went down, so it was.
So like almost 30 years ago, yeah, or 25, yeah.
No, not 30, but 25, or yeah.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, I think it was settled in 99.
Okay.
So
They're still using that as, wow. Oh boy.
yeah, and that was just for that district, but then all the other
Right.
districts adopted similar laws or viewed it favorably. So
Uh,
it technically hasn't been decided by the Supreme Court, but I would bet Look, I would bet you're going to win the lottery buying one ticket before you would have a success through the Supreme Court on this. So
Right, right. Um, so I know you've mentioned volunteers and then, 'cause, you know, you are the spokesperson and the organizer. So I'm kind of curious, like what kind of, if even if you want to shout out in certain individuals, but like what kind of help have you had behind the scenes with Stop Killing Games?
it's well, for the Citizens Initiative, I'm an unofficial spokesperson and organizer.
Mm,
Officially, I am not a part of it. However, I obviously have had some influence in, trying to help put this together and help out the official people involved, that sort of thing. It's been kind of anarchic with starting this because that's kind of how this formed. Is I made a video on the issue and I basically gave an SOS for help internationally, and I got some responses, and then we started formulating plans, and then I made another video and I received way more feedback, and from there we kind of set up some kind of group meetings and things like that to try to organize things in different areas because some people were able to help, do research or get things going in Germany, others in France, others in various other European Union countries. And then later, and then during that process, I found out about the European Citizens Initiative, and it struck me as very ambitious. And I wasn't sure, and I'm still not sure if I could get that many signatures, but I was thinking, well, I mean, I can't see a reason for us not to attempt this. I mean, it's kind of a long shot, but it doesn't sound impossible. So I decided to launch that and kind of reached out among existing volunteers to see if anyone was interested in becoming an official organizer and or spokesperson for this. And they had meetings and then voted on the official spokesperson. But several people have kind of like come in, help with something critical, and then just sort of disappeared. I'd say it's been like dozens of people like that. There's been many different aspects to this because I saw with the crew, especially, but later with the citizens initiatives and government petitions, I've kind of viewed all of this as my only shot because I feel like if we fail on all of this, then that's it. It's over.
hmm
So.
So have you thought like when it does reach a million signatures and things move forward, like what kind of role are you going to play? Have you thought about that?
Well, officially none, but it's been determined I would be allowed to attend the hearings on it as an observer. And I guess what I would do, honestly, I don't know because it could be the sort of thing where they discussed it and then there's a chance to convene and then I could, give my opinion to the organizers. And again, I will not be in charge, but in fact, yeah, it's not a hive mind. I mean, a lot of them do agree with my views. Some are more radical than me and might want to go farther than what I think would be strategic. Uh, but I might be able to convene with them and give my opinion, but ultimately it would have to be them discussing it. Or maybe it goes down and I never get a chance to talk and it's just them and I find out later after the fact what goes down. And so it's hard to say. Actually, and for all the consumer protection action, that's except for the UK, which we're going to take another shot at. That's all underway. So I literally have no influence on that now. My main influence was just having this issue reach their desk, and whatever they decide is what they decide. I have no direct kind of power really. So.
Mhm. I've been curious with since the initiative's gone up. I mean, you talked about pirate software, but what have other developers, whether they've reached out to you through email or Twitter, what kind of responses have you got more from the developer side of things?
I've gotten a lot of kind of thank yous from developers, mostly indie ones. And actually, I found out about it through others. Our probably highest profile one has been Running with Scissors, the
Right. Yeah.
creator of the Postal games. They've been in full support of it the entire way on Twitter. We also, I need to double check, but I remember thinking the creator of Cookie Clicker was also in support of this. Uh, let's see, there and there's several. There's a few I forgot the names of, but also besides developers, earlier in the campaign, we also had support and promotion from some members of European Parliament. Uh, Patrick Breyer of the Pirate Party and Nicholas Ninas of the Green Party. However, they both lost their seats in the last election, so fortunately we don't have anyone now. But that did help us push things a little bit more on the European front. Yeah, with developers, yeah, I'd say it's probably about a dozen that have kind of reached out to me, but there might be more I'm not aware of because I've said before, I'm not the ideal person to work on this, and part of that reason is I am not a social media master. I tend to just make announcements on Twitter and then just I have no idea what people are saying about me or where I'm being mentioned or anything. But I did have a medium YouTube channel size, so that's most of what I've leveraged with this.
Has anyone from like the publisher, because I know it's more about the publishers as opposed to developers, but have anyone behind the scenes reach out to you from a publisher, maybe from an anonymous saying, hey, this is how it's like behind the scenes? Or?
Yes, and I forgot to mention two of the organizers, the official organizers in the European Citizens Initiative are developers. Or no, at least two. There might be some more, but one's a game developer, one's a server software developer, has a lot of experience. So that I forgot I should mention them. For publishers, the only one I'm aware of that we've talked to a little bit has been GOG, where they're generally in support of this. However, they have to kind of balance it with their existing relations with game publishers so that they're not going to burn bridges, essentially. So maybe there's more of a mention later on, or maybe not. It's undetermined at this point. Other than that, I'm not aware of any. But that's not something we were really reaching out on also, because yes, the focus is more on publish. The focus is on whoever's making the decision to not let the customer continue running the game. And the bigger the company that is, the more that tends to be the publisher and not the developers. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's right. I can't give names or which companies, but I have had a few anonymous developers wishing to remain anonymous, that larger companies that were in support of this as well, because it can make sense. If you spent years of your life working on a game and then a few years later, nobody can ever play it again, and all you can ever show them is just like a YouTube video of it or something, that's a little demoralizing, I would think.
Not good for the resume.
So, yeah. If people can't even see it, but it hasn't been a focus to reach out to publishers because, again, not all, and again, I'd say probably not even the majority of developers, but the minority of them are kind of the problem to begin with. It's not that they don't know how to make games like this, and it's not that they're not aware that they're taking the game away from people. It's that they don't care or just isn't worth it to them. So I'm not sure what the dialogue would be about that. So that's why we're going through government to try to see if this is legal or not, or if it is, to be open to changing the law on this issue.
This is, I guess you brought up GOG. I did see in the last couple of days, they're taking down the games The Suffering, which kind of like mid-2000s, a game from, the time was Midway, which is now under the Warner Brothers umbrella. So currently, you could purchase it until September 1st of this year before it gets delisted. Did you see that at all?
I didn't.
It's somewhat related to Stop Killing Games.
Yeah. I mean, of course, that's an issue that is also problematic for game preservation. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't even know that there'll be so much more difficult to try to solve than what we're doing. So we're trying to go after essentially the worst of the worst, where when support ends, literally every person on Earth can no longer play it. Those are the ones we're focused on. Mm-hmm. For something like The Suffering, everyone who did buy the game before that date will be able to continue playing it. And in that case in particular, there were hard copies of the original one released in probably what, early 2000s or
Yeah,
something like that.
2004.
So you can still get a copy of it. Yeah, it's not ideal and it's going to be pricier and more of a hassle. And I think it does kind of is problematic to preservation. But in order to change that, you have to do one of two things. One would be a law mandating that they must keep selling this game. And that, while that might be reasonable for some games, for other games or just in general, that is kind of that is I would think that is kind of overstepping authority that a company must continue selling an old product. That could create a lot of complications, I would think. And I don't think that would be lawmakers would be very receptive to something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Or the other alternative, which in a sane world, I think would be the norm, but I don't see any chance of us changing this, would be, okay, after the company ends support, they're no longer selling it. Let's say a few years afterwards, that game enters public domain then. So in other words, right now the copyright expiration is something like the lifetime of the author plus 70 years or something like that. So it's like everybody's going to be dead before that enters the public domain. So that's not really a good solution. But again, in order to change that would be inviting so much opposition because you'd be taking on the likes of Disney trying to come against you, or all the film studios, or maybe record labels, just everyone trying to put a stop to this so they can keep these intellectual properties in their wheelhouse as long as possible. And ironically, I think a lot for somebody can fact check me on this. I think a lot for other mediums, these companies are still selling them and making them available to the public, because you can buy movies from like the 1940s or something like that, or real old music that it's still under their copyright. So you can buy a real old song or something that they still have the rights to. So there's an argument to be made that this is maybe anti-competitive, but the customer can still access this. Whereas games, it's like they're practically throwing them in the dumpster as soon as they're done supporting them. And it's just nobody wins from this. But in order to change that, you'd have to upend copyright law, and that's far more ambitious than what we're trying to do.
Mm-hmm. So going back to the petition, especially the European Union, I have kind of a few, we'll call them individuals. Like, how would you convince them to take action to sign? So if you have, like, let's say the younger generation who with always online is kind of like all they know, how would you convince someone like that to sign?
Well, the best quote I heard on this, which may or may not resonate with them, was actually from Linus from Linus Tech Tips talking about this. And he said something, and he's a parent, and he said something like, younger gamers today don't realize what they're losing by having these games disappear, because for younger ones, maybe they're into Fortnite or Roblox or some other game that's more popular with the younger demographic. Well, it might be hard to imagine, but those probably will be on the chopping block eventually. And the thought of never being able to play that game again, that's not a great feeling. And the other aspect of it is, every aspect of this is possible. So whatever you've heard about how this is impossible, no, that's not true. Now, what can be true is this could be very inconvenient or a hassle, but if the law is put into effect saying, no, this is going to be a requirement moving onward, I think they would be amazed how much the industry would conform to that. That's actually a good example of the similar strategy we're taking with Australia, where I think prior to 2014 or something around there, when you bought games on Steam, if you didn't like them, you couldn't get a refund. And Australia's Consumer Protection Agency sued Valve over that. Valve lost, and that ended up so Valve allowed refunds from that point onward, not just in Australia, but they made that global policy. because they decided, well, we don't want to have to keep fighting this court case over and over in every country, so we're just going to give in on this. And that's why even a win in a country like France or Germany, since if that's a major market that in order to sell there they have to have the end of life plans, if they've already done the work when they shut the game down, they probably will just make it global because it's not going to be much extra effort at all at that point. But yeah, I guess for younger gamers, just explain this is possible. You can retain games that you like, even online only ones. And it doesn't have to involve the company hosting the server forever. And you ask any kind of seasoned programmers, they will tell you this is possible. It's just I've compared this before to car manufacturers not wanting, in the 60s, there was law being proposed to make seatbelts mandatory to put in the cars. And car manufacturers fought that up and down. But then when they lost, the overall work and cost was pretty minimal, especially as time went on. They were tooled for that. And I think it's a similar analogy. Now, I think another demographic are people who are not gamers. So they're just thinking, well, why the hell should I care about video games? And that's an understandable stance. And what I would say to them is the only reason this is happening is because so many people, especially lawmakers, don't really care about video games. And that's understandable. There's a lot more serious issues out there. However, because of that, the industry has been able to kind of test more and more anti-consumer practices. And now they're making more money than the film and music industry combined because there's just barely any regulation on it. And so what's going on with video games could almost be seen as like a laboratory for what can we get away with for shaking down customers to make even more money. And we're seeing some of this start to bleed over into real world products. Like one has been for some cars, they want you on a subscription service to have heated seats, or things like printers, where if you, like, I think there were some printers that, this will seem dated, but that had like fax machine capability, but because the printer was out of ink, the fax stopped working. Or, because you're out of one color, well, now you can't print in black and white, or stuff like that. Yeah, I'd say printers, video games and printers are kind of the pioneers for coming up with some of the most consumer hostile practices out there. So yeah, if you want more and more things you own to behave like printers, and I'm sure anyone who's used a printer has had some negative experience with it at some point, that you're thinking, what is this legal? Or yeah, with printers have also had things with planned obsolescence where they'll put in the firmware, they design it to just fail and start giving errors, like, on like the 500th use or 2 years after it's activated or something like that. So unless you want more of that coming towards other products that you do care about, like, cars or medical devices or things like that, then this is very much a consumer rights movement also.
Right. So yeah, your answer there also answered my next person, which is like, how do you convince someone from their family, their parents, their brother, sister, husband or wife to sign, even though they don't play games, but kind of that, how it could spread to other industries.
I would give that as like the rough pitch, but probably the more effective one would be if the family member or the friend says, hey, can you do this for me as a favor? I care about this, even if you don't. And you can see what it is. It's basically just letting us keep the games we paid for. It's not something crazy.
How do you convince people? Not for me. Like I play mostly single player games but I came from a time frame where, this wasn't ever like a huge issue, but how about for people who don't play live service games or multiplayer games, or those who are like, oh, I can't wait till this live service flop dies off?
Yeah, well, you kind of gave it away in your question there. Okay, let's say you play mostly single player games. Well, we're seeing a lot of companies start to merge the single player with the multiplayer. So you can't distinguish the two, because stuff like The Crew 2, I mean, the Crew, Destiny, the Division, one of the Need for Speed games. Those are all multiplayer and single player just kind of mixed in together, and you have to connect online only for them. Or sometimes just for the separate single player campaign portion. Like I think some of the newer Call of Duty games are like that. Like I think Cold War was one of those where it has a full single player campaign, but you have to connect online to play it. So, or at least on the PC side. So this could be coming more to games that you like. Or you sometimes have games that are, yeah, technically multiplayer, but then they really have what you would expect from a single player game. Because one I have mixed feelings on, but I think it's pretty amazing is the Secret World or Secret World Legends, where yes, technically it's an MMO, but you can play through that whole game solo, and that has a very developed story to it. So this is coming for everything. It's just a question of what companies can get away with. And if this passes, then this is going to kind of keep your single player experience safe, is the way to look at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you brought up a lot of Ubisoft examples. I think it was either the first or second, I would have to double check, but the first or second Assassin's Creed game for PC, they had it for a while where it was online only. And I think they eventually pulled back because of fan backlash. But for something like that, yeah, it's something that they've done for a long time.
Well, one thing I should mention, nothing about our initiative affects any company while they're supporting the game, only when it puts an end to it. So actually, this would not affect that because they're still supporting it. So maybe the online only is an anti-piracy protection, or, well, there's other reasons they have too. One can be stat tracking or convenience to the players, but another is actually a reason we're not such a big fan of, but we're not seeking to interfere with it, is for additional monetization. So if they sell you the game but then they want to sell you a skin on top of that, well, if it's all connected to that server, then that creates the market for them because there's no way out of it. But yeah, unfortunately, this would not stop that. So if a new game came out and they wanted it to be online only while they're supporting it, then we wouldn't be changing any of that because you can still play it. Mm-hmm. However, once they end it, that's when the initiative would kick in that, okay, you have to have a way for people to continue playing this without having to connect to your server.
Mm-hmm. What about those who are against government intervention? How would you convince them to sign?
Well, I mean, I probably wouldn't, depending on how fervent they are about that, because look, that can be a very strong value for some people like that. I guess the question is, what's the alternative? Because what I've tend to hear is vote with your wallets or, boycott it. However, I have never known that to work for a game. There might be a fringe exception I'm not aware of, but I've never known it for a game where the game is enjoyable. So in other words, I've seen publishers can get away with basically anything as long as the gameplay itself is fun. Like, like we've seen this with other series, like, Diablo 2, you could run it offline or host your own game for multiplayer. But then Diablo 3, no, it's all online. A lot of people hated that, and yet it was one of the best-selling games of the time, or it might still have passed some records. So it's like, and we've seen that pattern with other things, that if the game itself is enjoyable, then get away with anything. So I don't think boycotting has ever worked, and I would bet money against it not working, or bet money on it not working, rather. I've heard one option is like clear labeling, but the thing is, I mean, I have stronger views about this, but if I was trying to convince them, I would point out that, a lot of the people, you're not really getting a representation of what the customers want, because just because a customer buys something, that doesn't mean that they like every aspect of it. That just means the product has some aspect of it that they like. So, I mean, I know some take this as proof. Well, if a lot of customers bought this, that means they're in favor of this. No, maybe it was some kid's mom who bought it for them and they just see racing cars on the front and that's as far as it goes. Or, it's, uh, I guess I've thought about, I mean, like you said, I've been making videos on this for off and on for 9 years and it's been bothering me closer to something like 25 now, geez.
Was it EverQuest
But
that was kind of one of the first major ones? That kind of where it started bugging
yeah,
you?
that was a little bit different flavor, but the concept that like, uh, thankfully EverQuest is safe because I think there does exist like server emulation option. Plus it might still be supported, I think. But just the conceptually, the idea that, okay, well, this great game that people are having great experiences with could just be shut down forever and then no one can ever play it again. That's just always bothered me on a fundamental level. But yeah, I guess what is the alternative? Because I have not seen any. And because you could try to convince the industry, but they're going the opposite direction. They're promising to make more series uh, online only, even ones that traditionally weren't. So the industries wants to go the opposite direction on this. Uh, Boycotting doesn't work. Um, Voting with their wallet doesn't work. So what option is left? I guess is what I would ask. But even then, I still wouldn't expect them to sign it.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
I'd be happy if they did.
Yeah. You have mentioned that there is an advantage to some of these lawmakers or those in the government not having a ton of knowledge of video games. Can you go more into that?
Yeah, I think that's actually a bonus because that means they're going to be looking at this almost purely through a consumer rights lens, or consumer rights versus seller rights, that sort of thing. And I think we're far more likely to get a fair understanding of the problem than if it was somebody deeply entrenched in the game industry and had a lot of kind of preconceptions. See, from my perspective, like I'll call out a lot of gamers an average. I think your average gamer tends to think that, okay, online only for single player, that's ridiculous and should not happen, and there's no excuse for that. But online only for multiplayer and then never be able to play it again, yeah, well, that's kind of how it works. Because they're so used to the industry thrusting that on them that they've forgotten, or maybe in some cases never even realized that no, this is entirely preventable, like all of it. Like even games that, yeah, I guess in case somebody's thinking this, even games that like the server component is so complex it could never be run in consumer hardware. Well, if that company was shutting down and they released the binaries to it, well, then the community could find some hardware that is compatible with that and try to get it going that way. So there's really no excuse for this, other than they don't want to. Um, and I derailed myself here. Okay, you were asking about the
And like what, like because
the
they have,
fairness.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So if they're coming in with those conceptions, or they are coming in with, they know how much work it is to change an existing game that was never designed for it, that might color their view on this, whereas that's the wrong lens to be looking at through. Whereas if there's someone who doesn't know anything about video games, but they're looking at this like, okay, they paid money for the product gave no expiration date, but then they look at the license agreement, and it's the license agreement often has terms like it can change at any time, it can be terminated at any time. You're given no time frame when this will happen, and like in the case of the crew, maybe others, you as the customer are required to destroy all existing copies of the game once they do end support for it and terminate the contract. Well, that's very likely to run up afoul of some other laws, like in the EU specifically, that I haven't memorized now, Directive 9313 EEC, which says that, if these contracts create an imbalance, or have unfair terms that create an imbalance against the customer, then they might be considered null and void. So they might be looking at it through that lens, like, okay, these terms aren't reasonable. They can't get away with this in other industries. And the customer paid the money, they paid them once, and then, but here, let's say they're trying to determine, like, they're unsure if these are goods or services. Like, okay, well, maybe these aren't really goods and they just need to be labeled as services. Well, then if they're a service, they're not telling the customer how long the service lasts. And that's not really how it works for the vast majority, maybe all. I'm not sure. And so this doesn't really seem in line with how we conduct commerce with almost everything else in our country. So, no, I think maybe we do need to have some corrections here. And I think that could be a big advantage because, you know, it's not necessary to know all these intricacies of how video games work. What's necessary is to have some fundamental understanding of consumer rights in that country.
So you've mentioned you felt that you're not the ideal person to kind of be the spokesperson for this. I disagree with that. I think you're great for it. But if you could mold, like shape from clay, like an individual who would kind of be the head of Stop Killing Games, what would they be like?
They would have way more publicity and influence and probably be smoother talking to people. I can be awkward or sometimes my cynicism shines through and rubs some people the wrong way. Uh, and plus I make all sorts, normally I'm making all kinds of like kind of weird, goofy videos of video games. So they're thinking like, should we really be trusting this guy to talk about this? Like this guy's weird. I don't know. I whereas I think the ideal person would be someone with just, millions. You'd want a much bigger media presence. I'm okay. I have a medium media presence where I was able to get things done, but somebody like a really big streamer would be ideal. And what they could do is they could basically, or having some funding too, have like a budget that they could just hire somebody to take care of this stuff and do all this research. And see, the ideal person would be somebody big so they can just tell their audience, go do this. And then they're paying somebody else or have like a team of people to do all the legal research. And then that team tells them what to tell the audience so that you could kind of get this kind of widespread influence and figure out what we need to say where. And then somebody like that, if they do have millions of subscribers, they're probably a lot better at delivering the message than I am. They can kind of keep it real simple, just only the most relevant points, know what works, what doesn't, have a better intuition on that sort of thing. Whereas I'm more stumbling around in the dark. So it's just
Have
kind
you
of grabbing onto any foothold I can find.
have you because you mentioned about funds, have you ever thought about doing any kind of, I don't know, fundraising is the right term, but kind of doing something like that, like a crowdfunding campaign to, we could put more people to this?
Yes. However, I haven't for a few reasons. One is all the consumer protection activity that's just kind of built into government functioning. I mean, that's already funded by taxes. So our main obstacle was just figuring out how to do it and direct people that way. And we were able to kind of hit the critical mass on most areas like that. Now, for the European Citizens Initiative, that's something where funding might help, but again, I'm not the master of social media or marketing. It wasn't clear to me where the money being spent on that would actually result in us getting significantly more signatures. And also, I had a certain hesitancy that, look, there's a possibility every avenue I'm taking on this crashes and burns. So if that's the case, I want to be really careful where I'm spending money or more importantly, trying to raise money from others on before pushing anything like that. Because, if I lose on this, I'd rather lose for free than lose and take people's money and set fire to it on the way down. However, one area there were two areas. The one, unfortunately, it's kind of fallen through or looks that way. Where I've thought that no, spending the money here, I think would really get us a lot of bang for our buck. And that was in Australia. And at one point, we were considering a possible lawsuit in Brazil, which could actually have been affordable, unlike many other countries. However, some things didn't quite line up, not with the law, but it's more like the firm kind of needed more information on how many copies of The Crew were sold or owned in Brazil, and we just had a lot of difficulty finding that information, and that kind of put everything at a standstill. But In Australia, one thing I was told early on is that a bunch of people complaining to their consumer protection agency might not be enough to get them to act on this, but an official letter from a law firm making a formal complaint would, or very likely would. So we looked into that, and I reached out to a lot of different law firms, and I think one of them replied, and most of them just kind of just never even responded. We were probably too small fry for what they were doing, but one did, or another one did, and agreed to take us on at a rate that was affordable. And actually, one person who had kind of helped me out in the past runs his own business. Ironically, has an online only game that he runs, and it's an old school kind of mud, where it's kind of text based,
Yeah.
but it's been going a long time. He has tens of thousands of players still. So he's making money off of that. So he was able to kind of, we had an agreement where in exchange for me kind of giving a promotion for him so he could write it off as a business expense, we could use that money to fund the legal team. And I think that has absolutely helped in Australia, and I'm not sure if we'd be getting as far as we would have without it. So I think that's paid off in the sense that whether we get a favorable rating or favorable outcome or not, we'll at least know we did about as much as we could have. Whereas without that, there'd be that nagging down. It's like, oh, geez, we really should have gone farther on this. So.
Mhm. Ross, is there anything else as we wrap up here? Anything else that you wanted to bring up, or?
Well, the website for this,
Hmm.
if you do happen to be an EU citizen or know someone who could sign this, is stopkillinggames.com. Try to keep it simple, so
It's catchy.
that should navigate you to the right place.
Yes. Yeah, and I'll link to that in the description and pin comment and all that. Yeah, that's everything on my end. So, Ross, I appreciate you doing this. I appreciate everything you've been doing with Stop Killing Games. It's I guess actually, I did mention in our emails I am Canadian. So, actually, I guess wrapping up on the Canadian front,
Okay, well,
yeah.
yes, we have it. This is also in the long shot category, unfortunately. But like I mentioned before, half of the battle is just getting a clear response from as to whether what's going on is legal or not. And on that front, we have launched a petition in Canada that is still active. There's a link to that through stopkillinggames.com.
Mhm.
However, I think it does end September.
Yeah, I
So
think
you might want
September
to move on
5th.
that
I
if you
think,
are
yeah, it's
Canadian.
pretty quick.
Oh, okay, so yeah, you know the date. Great.
Something like that.
So yeah, get on that. And that's what we're hoping to get at least. So if Canada wants to come out and says, yes, this is all allowed, well, then there's not a lot we can do on it. But if they say that, no, this is not legal, well, then maybe we do have some options there. So,
Mhm. All right, yeah. Yeah, stopkillinggames.com. As of recording this, you just released your latest Ross's Game Dungeon, Culpa Inata, which is a great watch, and I recommend everyone to go watch. And I assume you got more game dungeons in the pipeline.
yeah, in fact, I want to be done with this as much as I can on my end as soon as possible. This whole campaign thing.
Hmm.
I never wanted to be doing any of this. It's just I wouldn't have forgiven myself if I felt like I had the opportunity to act on it and I didn't, and then it all just fizzled out because of that. What I want to do is go back to stuff like Game Dungeon, which again is just kind of like a goofy kind of exploration of some of the various games, and almost all my stuff is comedy normally. So I want to go back to that. So if you're wondering what all these other videos are, that's what I'm normally doing, and it's not related to the campaign.
Yeah, I saw that comment. I think you pinned it for Culpa Inata saying like, this is what I usually do besides stop killing games.
Yeah. So, because the past few months, that's almost all I've been doing is this campaign to kick it off to make sure it was done right and I maximize our odds. So
Hmm.
look, if this all fails, I'm not going to be losing sleep on it because I'll know I did everything I could have. So.
Hmm. Yeah, so if that is the case, if it does fail, is it just kind of go on with your life as usual? Would you try maybe tackling something else along something similar to this, or?
Well, not on the legal front. I am done. Like, this is it. However, for extra legal options, what I would try to really, I've made a video on this before also. What I would really try to encourage people to do is look into stuff like AI extrapolation from either like the 3D depth buffer or just video. So like, let's say we have a game that we know it's going to be destroyed at some point. So what we do is we go through and just with video, just try to record every nook and cranny of it. Well, I think through AI extrapolation, you might be able to kind of port over a facsimile of the model and texture data to kind of save these game worlds. And then maybe if you had super fans, they would port that to another game engine and try to recreate many aspects of it that way. Because as insane as that sounds, that is a lot easier if we have the tools than something like reverse engineering a server emulator, which it's a miracle each time we get one of those. So that's probably where I would encourage people to pursue things on that, because I would know it's just all dead on the legal front. So.
When you bring up that reverse engineering, I did see with Battleforge that there was like a fan remake of it, but I think it took a good 4 or 5 years for that to go through.
Not only that, but I believe there's only that one in existence, and it's not accessible by the public. It's only accessible by the people who made it. Now, I think they're far, far more likely to have good stewardship of that emulator, but hey, maybe something happens and they get cut off and we're back to where we started again, and that no one can run it again. So there's always this precariousness to it. And until the public has access to some way to run the game, then I think it's not quite the same, but similar with Warhammer Online is another one where they're kind of keeping the good stuff in-house, which is understandable, but, can still make us a little nervous.
Right. All right. So Ross Scott, Accursed Farms, stopkillinggames.com.